Sure.
All right, I think we're 5 past the hour, so I think we should go ahead and launch in so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I know some of the English media and creative arts people are probably going to like run to the next thing at 1 p.m., so I want to give them time to run without interrupting. All right, well, thank you all for joining us here today. This is my first time speaking in the creative technologies side of things rather than, I mean, I'm not really speaking, but I'm in front of the room temporarily. But we'd like to welcome Professor Sally Bushell today. She is the real main act here. She is a professor of Romantic and Victorian literature in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. I believe my doctoral supervisor was at Lancaster. Before he was at Ohio State. Her research is concerned with literary spatiality and the mapping of texts in a range of ways across process, empirically, digitally. She is also interested in digital and spatial projects for the mapping of literature. She was PI on the AHRC-funded project Chronotopic Cartographies and the AHRC follow-on fund project Steampunk Sherlock Holmes in Minecraft. She is also co-creator of an educational project, Litcraft, that re-engages reluctant readers with reading by using Minecraft to map literary worlds. Her most recent books are Reading and Mapping, Spatializing the Text, and the newest, New Approaches to Digital Literary Mapping, Chronotopic Cartography. These are both with Cambridge. So if you could join me in welcoming Sally.
Great, thank you so much, Erin. So I'm going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes today. And I'm mainly talking about chronotopic cartographies and through timespace. So we've got kind of paper in 3 parts, I guess. The first part is going to explain the project and what we're doing and what the results were from that. And I'll just talk through the slides for that quite informally. Then I'm going to kind of think a bit about what, for me, so the role for me on the project was really to develop an interpretive method that uses digital tools and connects them to more traditional scholarship. That was basically my aim, my position. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the literary topology that emerges from the chronotopic mapping. And then the second, the third part here, which is about half the paper, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I'm going to apply it to Peter Pan. So the second half, the first half is sort of more digital, and the second half is kind of trying to develop a new method, an integrated method. So the Chronotopic Cartographies project was a major project, £1 million project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And if you get bored today, I don't know why the C's there, that's really annoying. But anyway, go and have a look at the website. There's lots of examples on the website for you to explore. Slight issue for us was it ended during COVID, which was really annoying because it meant we couldn't get it out there. So the last year and a half of the project, we were meant to be like disseminating it at all kinds of events, which we weren't able to do, but hey, that's life. So the core aims, the main aim, and the main reason we got the money was because it was solving a very clear problem in digital literary mapping, the massive world of digital literary mapping, which was that all prior projects had only mapped referentially, i.e. to real world places, rather than moving beyond that. So that's problematic in all kinds of ways, conceptually, but it's also primarily problematic because it means certain genres, obvious genres like sci-fi, but also poetry, any kind of fantasy, if they don't have a ground in the world, then you can't map them at all. So the main problem to me was, well, you can't have that as a model because it's not a fully universal model. So that was my primary aim, is like, let's create a way of mapping that does not require a ground in the world. For us, we're generating the maps, I'm using that term very broadly, as you'll see, out of the coded text, using a schema that we designed. And this was also quite important to me, so that there's a kind of authenticity there from my point of view. And yeah, obviously we were aiming to kind of create a new method. So the title of the project, Chronotopic Cartographies, comes from the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and this fantastic essay. It's 1970s, published in the West, but I still think it's an absolutely fabulous piece of writing on literary time and space. And Bakhtin defines this, the chronotope, literary time space, and says this represents the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relations that are artistically expressed in literature. So for Bakhtin, and actually for me, because I totally agree with him, this relationship, the way in which time and space are bound together in literature, he says is absolutely vital to the nature of literature itself as a kind of world and world building. So it all feeds into actually very current models as well. What attracted me to Bakhtin in terms of a digital approach was in that essay, what he does very, very effectively, to my mind anyway, is he sort of scales up and scales down. So to give you an example, a good example of a chronotope for Bakhtin would be a meeting on the road. I mean, Oedipus would be a great example. You know, you've got a very clear spatial point, absolutely pinpointed, and at that point an event occurs because these two people meet, because they're on a road, and that's absolutely central to the text. And what he does in that essay is he'll kind of scale it right up and say that, right, so, you know, the meeting occurs in, let's say, an adventure, and he'll look at how that shapes the whole mode, the genre, the nature of the character, etc. And he'll scale it up and scale it down and zoom right in on a key scene. So this scaling up and scaling down was very attractive to me, because in my view, again, that I think any kind of data visualization models that we have for literature have to be able to do that. It's like zooming in and zooming out, and you've got to do that really in relation to literary text. Second quote here is kind of my team's favourite quote. I had 3 RAs working on this with me. Because we kind of say, oh, it's Bakhtin's kind of anticipating what we're doing. We cannot help, he says, but be strongly impressed by the representational importance of the chronotope. Time becomes, in effect, palpable and visible. An event can be communicated. It becomes information. One can give precise data on the place and time of its occurrence. So it was a kind of really nice quote, because it's sort of like, that is what we're doing, what we were doing in the project, really making it visible. So, yeah, so Bakhtin sort of underpinned our project. And what we essentially did in the spatial schema, so we're using network, sort of standard network model, but for very different purposes from the norm, I guess. And this is also very much what I'm about, like taking standard scientific methods and using them in very different ways for the humanities. So we took his terms for the chronotopes, the core chronotopes. These are basically his terms, where they're a bit dated in some places, like provincial town, parlour, they're a bit 19th century. But I wanted to stay really true to Bakhtin. And these are like the core, so what we were doing when we coded up the text then is like chunking the text out in terms of the chronotopic space and as it moves across different chronotopes. Using that quite loosely. So, for example, a road here is defined as paths, travel, journey. So, you know, if you took Huckleberry Finn, the river in Huckleberry Finn would be a road in chronotopic terms. We added 2 new categories, which were not in Bakhtin, but which we really needed. Distortion, which is actually a massive issue, because it basically means not there, but there's so many different kinds of distortion. But anyway, that's the category we had. And meta-narrative, because we wanted to signal where texts were gesturing towards other texts very deliberately as well. So those were categories that we added in. So fairly simple model. So obviously we have the node. I'm going to show you the visualization in a minute. So the node for us was the topos, the place within the text, but it has 2 identities. So using the example here, these are from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It starts, he starts in the harbour. So harbour is the location in the text, and it also has a chronotopic identity. The harbour is a provincial town in chronotopic terms. We mapped within a node for what we call toporefs, internal place naming. We had quite a complex structure there wanted to allow for the fact that when place naming occurs within a literary text, you have direct place naming where you are, harbour, but you might have all kinds of weird references to things because you're talking about, I remember when I was in India or whatever. So you can get quite a mishmash, and we wanted to make it clear whether the name is there or whether it's actually indirect, so on. Then the connections between the nodes, also really important on the visualization. Again, so as you're moving through chunks, how are you moving from one chronotope to the next? Sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's indirect, sometimes it's jump, sometimes it's a projection, so you go out to another space, but then you come back. So we wanted to show that visually as well. So when I get to talking about the visualizations more in a minute, and using the maps, this is just really the main thing to hang on to in the colored maps is that purple always means essentially it's actually happening within the text. You know, Robinson Crusoe is on the island and you can walk across it, you can view across it. So purple is actual, real, if you like. And orange is nearly always indirect. So it's like a projection, a jump. It's often imaginative or fantastical orange. And then green at the bottom, not showing up very well there, is metatextual. So purple is real, orange is imaginary, crudely put. So yeah, just to show you a section of the code there. So again, this is for Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So when we do the visualization, you have like the space, the harbour, but that's like the symbol for the chronotope of provincial town, and these are all the little topographies within that node. And this is like the final visualization for the rhyme. So we also did different versions of the text. So in fact, there are 3 different versions of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This is the version with the gloss, which has a gloss. The gloss is usually on the edge of the text when you read it, of course. The gloss is to the left. But when you visualize it, the gloss actually performs a very central role because it's constantly locating. So here you can see like the distinction between the purple and the orange very clearly. So purple is the actual route. In the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the ship starts off here, I guess, and goes back, and goes all around, goes back to the harbour. At the same time, the tale is being told at the wedding, so it's jumping. So you're constantly jumping back and forth. So you have like the actual where they actually go, and then you have like the kind of indirectness of the telling of the tale. So it's showing both those, because in the literary space, both those things are actually really important. Again, just a kind of simple account of how we did it. It's a bit of a clunky method. I'd really wanted to get more money to kind of make a much better tool, but in the UK, when you apply bizarrely to the HRC, every project must be entirely original and unique, so you can't get money to develop what you've already done, which is insane, but there we go. So basically coded it up to our schema, ran it through Python, imported it into a data visualization tool and sort of cleaned it up a bit, but minimalized, and then put it back into Python for a kind of really nice final version. That's Oliver Twist. Okay, so one other thing to hit you with before we sort of look at some examples. The tools generated not a single map, but a series of maps. And again, that was really important to us because we were using maps in quite a knowing way. I'm saying maps, of course, they're graph topologies, but they function as a map of the text. So we wanted to make it clear that we didn't want the map to be like an absolute authority, like this is it. Because also we would also say in fact, even the different coder might generate a different version of the map, and I have that in the book where we play around with that, like 2 different coders actually produce very different visualizations. But the map series just shows, I guess each map prioritizes different information. So that's what it's doing, but that's actually very useful to you when you're interpreting the maps or trying to put them into an interpretation. So the complete map, well, I showed you the complete map for Rime, it looked okay because it's a small text. If you see the complete map for Oliver Twist, it's just like a ball of wool. It's useless to you. So the complete map is often useless. The topoi map is the most useful because it privileges the locations. It's the most readable map, I'd say. Interpretable is the topoi map. And there's various others. And the other one that's also really useful is the deep chronotope map. And this shows what percentage of the text is given to which chronotope. So that's quite interesting, and often it can be quite surprising as well. Again, just to give you a little sense of that, of the series, the map series, this is Peter Pan, we're going to get back to later, and the play version of Peter Pan. So you can see how each map has a very distinct identity. The Topoi map has a very split space, which we're going to get back to later. And actually the deep chronotope map for this text is also really interesting. I'm going to return to that later. It's a kite form, which is actually quite rare in what we do. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's my part one whistle stop account of what we were doing. So as I was saying to Erin earlier, it was a very stressful project in a way because my role was to develop an interpretive method out of it, and it took so long. We were probably about like 2.5 years into the 3-year project before we actually had any results for me to interpret. But what you can see, even from the examples I've shown you, is what we start to realize, like, okay, what are we looking at when we generate the visualizations, the map series? And what we would see is certain topological patterns started to emerge quite clearly, saying, oh, we're seeing a lot of these, we're seeing a lot of that. So then we start thinking, okay, what is that? What are we actually looking at? And we realized we're seeing the spatial form of the text for the first time, actually, because no other previous model has attempted to do this. Actually, what the maps are generating is the underlying spatial form of the text. And at that point, I was like, thank God for that. I've actually got a method that I can now write up. So, okay, so I'm going to switch in sort of reading my paper in a boring kind of literary studies kind of way now, just so I can give you more detail. So the maps, what I'm calling maps here, obviously, are really graph topologies that function as maps in relation to the text from which they are generated. So if we want to develop a spatial approach to digital literary mapping, it is worth thinking a little more about the potential of literary topology. Topology concerns a geometric object that has a continuous form and can be deformed into other shapes while still preserving its internal properties. So a famous and easily understood example is the Mobius strip. Topology is therefore fundamentally concerned with 3 principles: connectivity, relationality, and dimensionality. From a literary critical perspective, topological graphs release us into a model of relative rather than absolute mapping of different aspects of literary spatiality. So, as I said, those previous models was mapping, Frankenstein onto Geneva or the Swiss Alps, whatever. Whereas what we're doing is mapping the internal dynamics of the text, which arguably is of more use than the latter. So topological forms, as we can see in the kind of base model, there's 4 core forms, which are mesh, star, ring, and bus. And then you get kind of hybrid forms that come out of this, and these are actually really quite interesting as well. So the topological mapping method, if you start using this in relation to literature, it can work in different ways. So one way it can work is to uncover a spatial meaning hidden in the text that we would not be aware of without the visualization. So the most striking example we had of that for our project was from Gawain and the Green Knight, medieval text. Within this narrative, Gawain sets himself up as kind of the perfect knight and is brought low unwillingly. And he has a model of kind of exactness and balance, perfection that overdetermines his behavior. This is symbolized by the image on his shield, the pentangle, which is described very explicitly within the text. 5 things which meant more to Gawain than to most other men. These 5 sets of 5 were fixed in this knight, each linked to the last through the endless line, a 5-pointed form which never failed, never strong to one side or slack at the other, unbroken in its being from beginning to end. So actually what's being described is a topology, in fact, and Gawain adopts it as his symbol because it's this model of like perfect integrity, which is being tested in the poem, and as I say, a test that Gawain fails. So when we generated the deep chronotope map for Gawain, almost, unbelievably, we found there's a kind of 5-pointed star, a near perfect pentagram at the heart of the model and at the heart of the spatial form of the text. So you know, I used to do a lot of work on manuscripts, and you just find these, I don't even know what to call them, coincidences. You know, Freud says there are no coincidences, things like this, where you're like, well, is that just a coincidence, or is it absolutely astonishing that the text does have this geometric form at some deeper level functioning within it, which, you know, we were not aware of until we did this, until we generated the spatial form. So we can use that, we can read that in various ways, and we could say, you know, the text itself actually adheres to its spatial symbolism, whereas, you know, the human agent, Dwayne, does not.
Carbon dioxide monitor in the
What's happening?
carbon dioxide monitor on the windows, so they're
Calm down. I'll speak a bit more calmly. So this is one way of using the maps. To be honest, this is very Franco Moretti. If any of you know Moretti's work, Franco Moretti is very much like da-da with his visualizations, and that's not actually what I'm interested in. This example does work in that way. But I'm more interested in maps as kind of processes and as comparative. So for me, the dominant power of the model, still not fully tested because no one will give us any money to do any follow-up work, is comparative. So really where I think it would work most effectively is if, so for example, you know, we did a couple of ballads because the project was just a scoping project, so we were like trying out lots of different texts to see if it worked universally. But, you know, so we did a couple of ballads like The Rhyme and Idiot Boy and stuff. And we started to notice, okay, quite a few of them seem to be figures of 8. So then I was thinking, well, is the spatial form for the ballad, the dominant spatial form, a figure of 8? It could easily be, because it's like an out and back, you know, that would make sense. And of course, what you'd like to do is take a project, take like 500 ballads, run them all through it and see, you know, and you could make great arguments from that. So you have like a work like Lyrical Ballads claiming to be a really original work. Well, is it? Or actually, is it, in fact, spatially, it's very traditional. So to me, that's where you could really use these tools in really interesting ways. It's a bit frustrating that we can't do that. So a couple of focused examples as well. So the other thing it would allow you to do, and again, so it's got massive potential. You know, in literature, we read text either in terms of period, primarily period, or genre, effectively. Those are really the two main ways we read, or counter to those. But what this does is offer an entirely other way of reading text through the spatial form. In other words, to give two examples, so Frankenstein and War of the Worlds, right? You would not normally put these two texts together at all because they're from different periods and they're different genres. They're not totally different genres because Frankenstein, God, what is Frankenstein? But anyway, but if you generate the maps, you see, okay, they've both got a very dominant ring topology at the heart of them. So then again, well, so they have got something in common. Spatially, they're actually very similar. They've got this massive ring topology. So actually, why is that? When you stop and think about it, in Frankenstein, that ring is a grand tour of Europe that Victor undertakes with his friend Clerval. It's an entirely kind of false, it's a touristic travel for Clerval, but Victor is actually only doing it in order to get to the Orkney Islands where he's going to make the creature a mate. So it's actually a very interesting structure because it's not what it appears to be. And Victor is using it. He appears to be doing one thing, but he's actually doing another. So the topological form reveals a tension between the nature of travel and the motives for it in the text. It seems like it's a very goal-directed thing, but it's not. Comparison, in Wells' War of the Worlds, the main loop is the narrator trying to escape from London, and the secondary loop is his brother also doing that in a sub-narrative, to escape a Martian invasion. So in both cases, the topological movement of the main character is actually a compelled movement by an alien force acting upon them. And so we can start seeing, actually, there's quite a lot in common going on here. And again, another of those, like, is it coincidence? There are no coincidences, is these little loops, so this little loop here, and that little loop there, off the top, that look like they're not important, but are actually fantastically important in both those books. So this is the final destination where Victor is supposed to make the creature a mate doesn't, and from there the whole thing unravels. You know, now he's on his case. That's the end of him. And this little loop is a ruined house where the narrator a Martian ship lands on top of the house, and the narrator, I don't know if any of you read War of the Worlds, great actually, gets trapped in the house, and he nearly dies of starvation because he can't get out until the Martians have left. So he's sort of almost, and then he manages to escape. So very interesting, the little loop off the top in both cases is the point where the threat is at sort of maximum intensity, and then, you know, the story unravels from there. So we wouldn't normally put those two texts together in literary studies, but actually when we do, it's surprising what we get out of them. Second example I touched on, I drew your attention to earlier, kite topology. So this, again, this is one of those, these were the only two texts, the only two maps we found in the text that we did. And we're expecting kites, I'm like, oh, there's a kite. What the hell's that doing there? You know, hadn't seen that before. And the two texts for the kite, Utopia and Peter Pan. Same thing, not two texts that you would normally read alongside each other at all. Then I started thinking, well, why is it a kite? Okay, it's a kite because the kite is showing that it's kite is quadrilateral. It has four sides that can be grouped into two pairs. So it suggests a world where the chronotopes are balanced or mirror each other. And of course, that is what is happening in both these texts. So in Utopia, you have like a realist world of Antwerp, which is in purple on this side, and then you have Utopia, which is countering it. So that's why you get a kite, because it's very dualistic spatial form. And in Peter Pan, you have the nursery, which is the safe realist space of the novel, semi-realist, and then you have Neverland, which is set against that space and is increasingly threatening it. So again, same thing. You know, when you let the spatial form lead your interpretation, you see, okay, these texts actually do have a lot in common. You could definitely read them alongside each other, even though we normally would not. So just to pull that together, that section together then, some of the conclusions that came out of the work for me. Actually, when I started the project, I was very committed to, like, everyone should be doing relative mapping. We should only be mapping relatively, not absolutely. I've changed my view on that over time. So I actually think the more different ways that you map, the better, basically. If you map a text in all different ways, you just see different things. Definitely, we've done some work since this on the Holmes, because we've got the Holmes project, mapping Sherlock Holmes in London, and mapping Oliver Twist onto London, and doing relative and absolute. And it's really interesting because the relative is almost like an inverse. It gives you different information from the absolute. So they really do work well together, in fact. So that would be my final position, do both, ideally. Yeah, it's very much the project's about, as I said, adapting the quite traditional tools that are used in quite traditional ways in the sciences, but doing very different things with them. And also, crucially, the next point, celebrating subjectivity within digital tools rather than denying it or pretending it isn't there when it is there, sort of really bring it to the fore. This is the method that emerges, which I'm going to apply in a minute. Essentially, for us, an iterative structure for literature can work really well if you move between, kind of read the text, generate the maps, read the maps, go back to the text. Maybe make a second series of maps if you need further information. You make a partial series of a particular section. Kind of having an iterative model allows us to integrate traditional forms of analysis with visualization of data, which is that's a very counter model. Erin will know that within our discipline. They've been very split, like you do it this way, it's got to be scientific or not. I really don't agree with that. I think we need to bridge it, and so that's what I'm trying to do here. Ultimately then, I think hybrid methods are definitely the way forward for digital humanities, and that's what we're good at, seeing things multiple ways. We should use digital tools to see things multiple ways as well. Okay, final section then. Don't know how I'm doing for time, David. Or if I've been wittering on. I'm all right, about 15 minutes. So this is quite literary, so if you're scientific, go off and have a look at the maps if it bores you. So Peter Pan, very interesting text in its own right. So in her powerful critique of children's literature, called The Case of Peter Pan, Jacqueline Rose reminds us that J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan was retold before he had written it and rewritten after he had told it. And what she's referring to here is the multiple forms that this text takes. So there is no single version, if you like, of Peter Pan. So the earliest text is a very odd book called The Little White Bird, which is one of those sort of whimsical books written by adults speaking to children in the early 1900s. And Peter Pan occurs as a kind of contained narrative within that book. Then in 1904, there's a play of Peter Pan, which is put on in London, but the text of the play is not published, so it's acted out, but it's not actually produced as a text. 1906, Barrie publishes Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, which takes the contained section from the earlier book and does it as a separate text in its own right. 1911, he publishes Peter and Wendy, which is what you would think of probably as Peter Pan, the prose narrative. 1928, he publishes the play text, quite a revised version actually from the earlier one. So the text morphs across genres as well as versions. So Barrie, also very interestingly, Barrie himself repeatedly and publicly asserts a model of multiple co-authorship. So this is his dedication to the 1928 play script to the Llewellyn Davis boys, whom he kind of writes the stories for, and then they grow up and he writes it for the next one and so on. I have no recollection of writing the play of Peter Pan. You had played it until you tired of it and tossed it in the air and gored it and left it derelict in the mud and went on your way singing other songs. And I stole back and sewed some of the gory fragments together with a pen nib. Any one of you 5 brothers has a better claim to the authorship than most, and I would not fight you for it. So Peter Pan is a composite text and one that seems to kind of glory in its own multiplicity. But what I wanted to look at today is to think, well, is what's true of the text also true of the maps of the text? And both exist in a state of becoming, and this allows them to be aligned in the kind of interpretive method I'm proposing today. So to put it into practice, I want to return to Peter Pan and work comparatively across both maps and texts. So we can start with the first version, if you like, discrete version, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. So the map on the left is by Arthur Rackham, who's a very famous illustrator, 19th century illustrator, for the first edition. And it combines, in itself, it's actually a literary map. It combines the real and the fictional version of Kensington Gardens, which is where Barrie walked with the boys, but then also where the stories come about. The map on the right is the Topoi map generated from that text. And again, another one of those weird coincidences. It's like a fairy. It's like it's got wings, the topological map. It just happens to be like that. So Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, in the text, the environment is very strongly demarcated by the adults and the narrator. The gardens are bounded on one side by a never-ending line of omnibuses, over which your nurse has such authority that if she holds up her finger to any one of them, it stops immediately. She then crosses with you in safety to the other side. So in this text, we have a very well-known spatial distinction between map and tour. Here we have the tour mode in play, but it's applied so emphatically within the text that it becomes a highly controlling trope for both character and reader. Narrative voice is strongly linked to spatiality and to the contained nature of the spatial experience for the child. At times, the actions of the child seem almost predetermined by this voice. You can't be good all the time at the round pond, however much you try. You can be good in the broad walk all the time, but not at the round pond. And the reason is that you forget, and when you remember, you're so wet that you may as well be wetter. So if we look back to Rackham's map, you can see that this sort of the bounded nature of this space is actually felt very strongly in it, with the railings along the top and the bottom, and they've got the broad walk, the baby walk, and the serpentine cutting it off. So it's visualized as a very contained space. So as I said before, what we repeatedly find when we use topological maps to analyze spatial meaning within the text is that they often draw attention to a tension between different ways of experiencing the same place. So in a work such as Peter Pan, that tension is primarily centred on the difference between the adult's experience of that space, or what they want that space to be, and the child's. And the park is a great example of this. The adult seeks to protect the child and thus to create a safely contained space. Actually, in this case, quite oppressive. It becomes quite oppressive. However, in Peter Pan in Kensington Garden, the figure of the child who's being spoken to is doubled. So we have a compliant and controlled child, who's called David in the text that the narrator is ostensibly talking to. Then we also have an alter ego in Peter Pan when Peter Pan appears within the text as well. So the first child conforms and accepts the model of containment. The second seeks to transgress it. In the relative topological map, the topoi map, from the text, we can see the same places are privileged. So Island in the Serpentine, we've got like the boardwalk up there, the same places and the round pond. But the relative map strongly registers the difference between the actual place, which is the purple, and the imaginary. So this is like the fairies down here, and this is Peter Pan on his island up here. So it shows much more clearly the distinction between like the adult world, which is the realist world, the safe world, and this other world that's starting to threaten it. So we start to see that the distinction between adult and child correlates to that between realist places that can be named and visited and that can set out this space, and imaginary or fantastic ones. In fact, if we look back to Rackham's map, what we see is that he too registers the spatial distinction and the kind of ambiguity of the space, the danger of the space, with the river flowing off the map at the top, right-hand corner. And the island, so this is Peter Pan's island, I think that's Peter Pan there in his little boat, hung in suspended non-representational space. It's just goes off the map. And when we return from this to the text, we find that this indeterminate space is registered within it. A small part only of the Serpentine is in the gardens, for soon it passes beneath a bridge to far away, where the island is on which all the birds are born and become baby boys and girls. It's very weird. So the island in the Serpentine is both deeply contained, nested within the park, safe space, but it's also threatening to escape into a kind of another place, which of course it is going to do in the next version of the text. So if we compare the topoi map for Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, which we know now, with another from the same series, same text, the Chronotopic map, this shows a far greater equality between the imagined child space and the realist adult for the text as a whole. The purple lines represent direct movement in the world, with the dominant chronotopes of encounter and road, and this is the narrators taking a turn around the park, meeting socially with others and so on. But with public square and castle also figuring quite strongly, suggesting that repressive element. The mesh topology, which is what it generated, creates a different kind of nest in which the real adult and the imagined child are interconnected, but with a sense of the imaginary space starting to sort of pull out of the adult one. So here we can use that comparative model to compare the same maps, different maps for the same text. But what we can also do with something like Peter Pan, where we've got different versions of the text, is compare the same map across texts. So if we compare the Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens with the play, which we already looked at earlier, the kite form, you can see that the space, so what the maps are showing are how the space is morphing over time. So crucially, Neverland does not appear in Kensington Gardens at all. There's just that little tiny mention that I've given you. Okay. In the play, the first play it's just mentioned, it basically becomes more and more dominant as the texts go on. So there's a layering of spaces as the real is increasingly supplanted by the fictional. In the kite, the parlour at the heart of it is a kind of doubled space because it corresponds to the nursery, the safe space of the nursery, but also to the home underground in Peter Pan, where Wendy is telling the tales and she's playing at Mother. And in the text, I don't know if you remember this, but it's essentially, they start to get lost in that. They're like, are you our mother? They start to think Wendy is their mother. They start to get really confused, and that's when they decide to return home. So the maps are showing essentially that the dominant space, the space in the Netherlands, starts to threaten to completely supplant and kind of overcome the safe space of home. And you can see the kind of intermingling if you look closely at the parlour. So this is like the parlour with all the sub-namings. You get an intermingling of like London, Bloomsbury drawing room and so on, and the much more sort of threatening spaces of the home underground, the little house in the Neverland and so on. The two namings are kind of coming together. So finally, we can go further. We can read the same map across all three texts to see the spatial evolution of Neverland and the increasing separation of these two worlds. So I say the gardens, everything's contained, it's threatening to escape, but doesn't. In Peter Pan and Wendy, we get much more discrete spaces, and we start to get, you can see number 14, that is the home, the safe space of the adults, and Peter's home against it, but there's no particular focus here. But when we get to the final 1928, we've got two spaces being absolutely set against each other as the Neverland starts to kind of really impinge upon the text. Now, instead of one space being safely contained within another, or at least anchored to it, the two worlds of adult and child, control and freedom, realism and imagination, are barely linked at all. And in fact, this is only occurring through the stage directions here, the metatextual links, which are stage directions. And Neverland starts to look far more oppositional. So a relatively non-threatening space at the start and the early versions of the text evolves into something much more disturbing as it goes on. And the digital maps allow us to actually trace and see that visualization. In the example of Peter Pan, then, the digital maps draw out and emphasize a core spatial tension present in the text itself, but which develops and unfolds across the totality. Spatial enlargement from the real setting of Kensington Gardens to Neverland is also a shift across forms that gradually gives more and more power to the spatio-temporality of Peter himself, who is no longer anchored in the real and becomes increasingly threatening as a result, until the imaginary threatens to entirely displace the everyday. Ultimately, such a space is disturbing to both adult and child, precisely because Neverland is an exact inversion of the safe controlled space of the park, with its bounds of space and time and its adults controlling it. Play is only definable as play because it ends. The park gates close at the end of the day. So a place of permanent play, which is what Neverland purports to be, is an impossible paradox. There's a sense in which Peter's world is neither that of the adult nor that of the child, as this spatial tug-of-war suggests, but increasingly somewhere that nobody really wants to inhabit permanently, not even Peter. So I'll end there. I'll just put up my final slide with the book on it as well. So this is available now from Cambridge Elements, and it's open access, gold open access, so you should be able to read it free. I haven't tried to do that myself.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. It's really interesting to see these kind of familiar tools kind of built upon and redeployed. So thank you. I wondered if anyone had any questions. I have notes, but Porg.
Thank you very much. Just a very small thing. I wondered, did you have a method for determining the distance between nodes?
Distance in how would you measure that distance?
Well, on the maps, some nodes are clusters that are far away from the rest.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, is that distance between groups, between clusters, generated computationally?
Yes.
Or is this part of your own interpretation of what's separating different things?
No. So what you're touching on straight away. I mean, really, we've sort of cheated with time. So even the chronotope is cheating with time, really. It's really a spatial model that sort of allows for moments in time. But the minute you start to say something like that, so the distance on the visualizations will be created, I think, by how far apart within the text they are, because we're privileging the text. But as you say, what that's really about, underlying that is different forms of time as well as space. So then we looked at this. So it's like, should we be doing a whole other thing that privileges time, not space? So for example, how are you measuring it? Is it, the time it takes to read the text, the number of words the distance as represented within a text, which may or may not be measurable. And actually then you're starting to get into like, how would you measure time? How would you map time? And that's so difficult because there's just so many different ways of doing that. So there is a consistent method, but it's basically the space of the text. Same as the deep chronotope. It's like what percentage of text is given to the deep chronotope.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up just because I'm curious?
Yeah.
So how is that operationalized? I mean, is the space of the text quantified? Like, did you make a decision to do number of words or reading time, or are those layouts created? Like, how are the layouts created? I mean, is there an algorithm?
Yeah, so you're using an algorithm, yeah.
So
In the book, I kind of explain, I do give that. I was like, actually do need to look at very closely at the absolute intersection between the human and the computer. So we use an algorithm that does that systematically. And we minimalized, for the most part, manipulation of the algorithm. So we let it run, fix it. We didn't change things around. Occasionally we do for a specific text like Alice, where we lay it out on the chessboard, but we're obviously manipulating it. So so I do explain that. There's a set algorithm which was for small text. Specifically, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head.
You may also explain this in the book, but just because I'm curious. Why do some of the graphs have straight edges?
Yes, that is an issue for me. That is an issue. So you can just display it either way.
Right, I know in Gephi it's just a toggle. So that's why I didn't know if
you can either do curved or straight.
Okay.
So again, what tends to happen, I always did straight. I don't know why I did. I would always do straight. But then others would always do. So that's it's another great example of like coda. Of course, it does make a difference because my fairy wings.
Well, that's
straight,
what made me think of it. So there wasn't like a principled decision, like in some.
No, there wasn't. There's an aesthetic choice right at the end. You can choose to have it straight or curved.
Yes, thank you.
And some coders tended to use privilege one and some the other. But that is a bit of an issue.
Just curious. Thank you. Yes, Justin.
So thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I was just going to follow up to Warwick and Aaron's questions to flag a publication by a graduate of this university Edward Kearns, who developed an XML schema to encode time in narrative. It's published on it in Cultural Analytics Journal as well. So if it's something that you considered incorporating or adding on, that's something to look at. But my question was going to be in reference to your claim about this method uncovering spatial meaning hidden in texts. And juxtaposing things like Frankenstein and World Worlds, I thought was really interesting. So when you're able to do this, to what do you attribute these meanings, or what, putting these things in association with one another, do you think about these patterns as being intentional, or are they arising
No, absolutely not.
genre? Yeah, so where are they coming from? Yes.
I mean, they are coming directly from the spatial nature of the text, because the Utopia one's a great example of that.
Yep.
The spatial, the way the space of the text works has generated the dual world. So that does really kind of like, okay, that does prove the thesis. So I guess, I mean, spatial meaning is always in text. To a large degree, you've got deictic meaning all over the text, haven't you? Yeah. So it is built in. It's not necessarily consciously built in, and of course it is linked to genre. So adventure novel will go off on a quest and come back home. It will have a circularity. So there are obvious spatial forms like that, like the adventure novel. We kind of know it's a quest. The quest has a particular shape. I guess my point would be actually that every text does have a spatial form.
Do those correlate then to genres, or
they will? Again, I mean, I can't make those claims because it was just a. That's where I'd really like to take like a key form in poetry, a key form, look at loads of texts. You could only really prove that by, doing the work over many more, 10 texts in each genre, 10 key texts in a genre. And what would be interesting then, That's what I was saying about the words. So Wordsworth and Coleridge lyrical ballads, the claim made for that volume is it's very experimental, it does new things with the ballad. But then you could actually say, well, I mean, maybe it does in some ways. It actually, in some ways, it's very conventional. Does it actually? So you could genre-breaking text, you could start to test and go, actually, does it do it spatially, or is it using the spatial conventions and doing it in other ways? So there's a lot you could do with that in relation to genre. You could play off the spatial against the generic. So both Bakhtin and Moretti, Franco Moretti, who's obviously like the big name in the field. I mean, Moretti is basically nicking Bakhtin and not really fully acknowledging. He's massively Bakhtinian under the surface, massively. But anyway, both of them are essentially making that point that genre is spatial. Genre has such a strong spatial element, which is true. So you'd want to really have to designate the interface between genre and pure spatial form, question mark, do you know what I mean? But there's loads you could do with that. Yeah.
Just when you were talking about ballads, I was struck, the old characterization of ballads as being an 8 and 6. You said they have a figure 8, like.
Yeah, nice.
Another one of those kind of coincidences.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to do with the coincidences.
I don't know.
I just enjoy them.
I'm in Jesuit material at the moment, so. Did anyone have any other questions? Maybe not about Jesuits. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I wonder, in the book, do you explain a little bit about how you categorize your chronotopes, how you identify them with the sequence or part of the narrative, say distortion and dream versus
the other
word, or is that something that could define what comes out in the map, I suppose?
Absolutely.
So
that's actually very problematic because it involves a judgment call. So in fact, in about the first year of the project, we hired 10 postdocs to code for us, and we had to throw it all away and do it ourselves because we realized, so if you had to already know the text to mark it up for the chronotope. When they were doing it and they hadn't read the text before, it was just so wayward. So again, I mean, this is a big question. Computer scientists hate me because I would say, does that really matter? Does it really matter? When you will agree on certain chronotopes, but some of them are very ambiguous, like threshold, for example. That's very ambiguous. Like, even if it is a threshold, at what point do you determine that the threshold has been crossed? So my position, obviously people could shoot me down in flames for it, would be there's a lot of subjectivity in that. Why is that a problem? Actually, why couldn't each critic will read a text a different way, so why couldn't each critic use the tools and generate, they wouldn't be radically different, but they'd be subtly different. Again, in there, I have a section in the first chapter, at the end of the first chapter, where we code up A. Houseman's The Shropshire Lad, great poem, and I did it, and James, who was the linguist on the project, did it, and James was the most scientific on the project. So we both coded up the same text and they look completely different. Mainly because we made a structure, so I made a structural decision early on, like each poem I'm considering part of a greater whole, I can't remember which way around it is, and he did the opposite. And then it generated 2 very different looking maps. So I put that all in there. So, I mean, is that a problem? Is that really a problem? It's a problem if you're a scientist and you want to say this is an absolutely fixed model that will generate a standard thing every time, but I'm not a scientist. Anyway, open question.
thanks very much.
Well, just to completely understand the process, there's the program, but then there's an interpreter along the process that's
When you're coding the text up, you've got to decide, well, there's actually 2 major things that are very subjective, really. Where does each chronotope end? Working through the text, decide, oh, that's the end of that, right? That we were in the provincial town, okay, the harbour. We've left the harbour, so we're obviously somewhere else. Okay, that's easy. But maybe when he moves from one space to another, has he moved from idle to anti-idle, or has he crossed a threshold? Someone else might put a threshold in between idle and anti-idle. Do you see what I mean? So as you code the text up and decide this is the chunk, this is the chunk, this is the chunk, that's one major decision where your chunk ends, and the other one is what you think the chronotope is.
how long was the process of, let's say, one particular book? Was it?
It actually doesn't take that long once you work. Well, I'm saying that I didn't do like the big realist novels. Becca did the big realist novels. Oh my god, that was quite bad. I did Robinson Crusoe, which was really bad. It doesn't take that long. This is why I like to do a poetry one, because the poetry was so much easier as well, and you could get lots of results quite quickly. Once you got into it, so you do like one pass, so you do one thing, chunk out the chronotopes, then do a second pass for the links, and do a third pass. It didn't take that long. Sort of get into it once you're doing it.
Last question then. Do you think developing AI could automate this process in somehow?
I think AI would really struggle with this because there's a lot of subjectivity in the decision making. It would be a good test, wouldn't it?
I'm wondering if Justin's question about genre is relevant again here, because I can see a large language model handling something like a realist novel pretty reliably.
Yeah.
But I think even most humans would struggle with poetry, especially, I mean, even within poetry, different modes of poetry.
Yeah.
I mean, an epic is going to function
Yeah.
generally very different from a lyric,
Yeah.
although then what do you do with Paradise Lost?
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
So we did have kind of linguistic computer guys on the project as people on the project, and they were always trying to say you could just automate it, you know. And then we'd have when we had a workshop day, I just gave them a page from To the Lighthouse. Just tell me how are you going to do that? And one page into the Lighthouse, it's like going, you know, how the hell is a computer going? It's a very sophisticated computer.
yeah. But I think it might do better with Dickens than with Woolf,
Yeah,
or it might do better with Austen.
yeah, certain text.
So, yeah, so that's why I do think genre and period might be key.
Yeah, so the other thing is the distortion. So distortion's a problem because the more you get into modernism and postmodernism, there's so much distortion, like the whole text is distortion, and then you're not, to me that was a weakness of it. So really you want to distinguish between memory, moving into the part, different, again, more time really. Like, is it a memory? Is it purely imagined? Is it projected? Yes.
Sometimes you don't worry about that just in a regular close reading,
Yeah,
much less trying to code it.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you think there are layers of subjectivity so that, for example, you talked about harbour, you could imagine an AI-style analysis picking out things like harbour pretty reliably, possibly. But then you mentioned threshold, which is a much more subtle interpretive thing. So, it sounds like, in an ideal world, if you had a tool that could do this, it would be a wonderful thing because you could have massive amounts of material. But could you develop a tool that could at least provide a fairly standardized or reliable, more superficial interpretation, maybe requiring a more literary critic to find the deeper symbolic things? Would that be a way to approach?
Maybe.
It would help you scale up.
Yeah, it would. Like the ballad. I mean, the ballad project, I'm kind of thinking, that is a good project. That would be a good project because you've got all these collections of ballads. You could take massive collections, 3 major, really influential Percy's ballads, whatever.
And they're already digitized.
Yeah. So it would be. You could use it and test it. If anyone's up for it, let me know. And test you. What I'd like to do if I was doing that is test an AI versus a human, and see what happens in either case. Yeah.
Even, the ideas seem very rich, and even a light version, LITE version, could be very interesting for people in other genres, other languages.
Yes.
Even if it's not as deep and rich as the work you've done.
Yes.
So even harbor. I mean, how often do you see harbor used metaphorically? Safe harbor. Tricky. You definitely need a level of human supervision.
Yeah, but the AI is getting
Train
pretty
it.
good for
You can't train it. Yeah, you can train it up. I mean, if you did the ballad, obviously I'm a romanticist originally, so that there's you'd have a very specific period, about 50 years, where they're collecting ballads like mad. So you've got quite a set time period. So it could probably learn that language quite quickly. Yeah. You'd have a lot. The ballad would be good because it's quite stock form in a way.
And shorter.
You'd have a lot of stock language and a short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
reflecting on the complexities of subjectivity.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how a novel like Ulysses would look like, and also is to can have the raw data. This data has to be interpreted under certain models or parameters or whatever, and here is where subjectivity says, but probably the interesting thing is not the universality of an answer, but the model itself that can generate different points of view of how we experience and see. And to do that visually is easier. So the conversations can happen. So I was thinking a kind of a very simple application that people can put inside their own data, and they can interpret that. So you will have different, it's like when asking a child to draw an object, and every single child will make something different. And here is where the richness and so I wonder how this model, or creating a kind of playful model, can reveal these hidden subjectivities.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the issue, isn't it? Sort of coming back to like Warren, the instinct of most people in digital humanities is how can we do it quicker, faster, and more reliably. And I suppose I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in playing that off against you, but I'm not. That makes it uninteresting to me if we do that. So I'm always like, let's do the opposite of that. Let's look at how can we actually explore, make space for subjectivity within the tools. I mean, I can see, of course, that makes them much less reliable and scientific. Of course, it does. But I sort of think, I don't know. I just think it's not interesting to the humanities. We have to find a way to work that allows us to look at what we're interested in.
Can I just ask a question? Like, if we want to remove subjectivity, or no, not remove, if we want to leave subjectivity, still, like, why do we still need the tools? Why not draw the diagrams by hand?
Because we couldn't. I mean, we couldn't do that, could we?
I don't know. Could you? Pen and paper?
I mean, because Moretti will often say, that's what people always say to him. It's like, well, why do we need it? It was in the text itself, like the Peter Pan. All of that was in the text. Why did we need them out? Why do we need visualizations? So I would say, no, the visualizations do show you, I mean, obviously they do. We've seen that. Show us stuff we didn't know was there. And they do, but I always want those visualizations to feed into interpretation, to feed into more.
Well, the best digital humanities work does lead to new interpretations. But my question, it's not why do we need the visualizations? It's why do we need computer-generated visualizations?
Because we wouldn't be able to do that. The complexity of that visualization is beyond our capacity, so we do need the tool to do that, especially for like a big, for a big novel or something, I mean, I'll come back to my final point on the new methods. Is we need hybrid methods. I don't think there's any one way. The main problem for literary studies has been, because of Moretti and Joppers and others, that they've gone, it's this way or no way. That is the big problem. It's like, there's absolutely no reason for that. Yeah, sure, do what you want. Yeah, you enjoy doing that. That's absolutely fine by me. I've got no problem with it. But there should be multiple. Why aren't there multiple ways? Why can't there be multiple ways? Why can't we play one way off against another?
I think there are. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of pushback on Moretti in particular in the last decade. Yeah, interesting. Do we have any other questions, comments? I'm aware that I'm talking a lot. I'm trying to stop. No? You're just dying to go back out in that rain, huh? All right. Well, I think that's about time anyway. So if we could thank Sally one more time.
I mean, I really am up for anything. So if anyone wants to get back to me and go, why don't we play around with something? I'll give it a shot.